Welcome to Chapter 9, Practice and Instruction. The purpose of this chapter is to describe the fundamental features and strategies that make for effective practice and the instructional techniques necessary to implement and maximize practice effectiveness. Specifically, this chapter focuses on constraints-led learning, discovery learning, and deliberate practice models that provide the essential characteristics of practice. With this understanding, the learner and instructor can develop practice and training programs and individual mindsets to maximize learning and performance, avoid pitfalls, and overcome setbacks. Using the word practice in a health and phys ed degree is pretty easy because almost everybody listening to this has had experience as an athlete, either in a team or an individual sport. So even though it's used interchangeably with the word training, in kinesiology and exercise science, it's really important that we define these terms differently based on what is targeted for improvement. Practice is typically aimed at learning decision-making skills and motor execution skills, or more precisely, improving mental performance, tactics, strategies, team play, and motor skills. On the other hand, training is aimed at improving physiological functioning and physical proficiency abilities. In the chapter 9, it's used often in the term of practice, but interchangeably, the principles of developing training programs are largely the same as practice skills. Remember, the skills needed or the type of practice necessary depends on the kind of learner and what the particular needs are. Although there are some fundamental characteristics that are consistent in practices, regardless of the circumstances. The nature of practice must vary depending on the needs of the learner. For example, a child learning to ski has a really different set of needs than a world-class Olympic skier who is training to be an Olympian, or perhaps maybe somebody that is in the adapted environment and is learning to ski without the use of legs. All approaches in instructional strategy are based on decades of research, and they emphasize the most recent discoveries involving information processing skills such as memory and attention, experimental work with discovery learning paradigms, system theories with constraint-led approaches, and research work underscoring the development of expert performance through deliberate practice. In this OLM, we'll provide a brief overview of these paradigms before detailing the 5 essential features of practice. We have previously discussed how movement emerges from an interaction of individual, task, or environmental factors. Each of these factors imposes limitation or constraints on how movement can emerge and thus requires the nervous system to look for ways to accommodate or take advantage of the situation. Constraints include game rules and time, muscle strength, fatigue, emotional state, and even the playing surface traction. These are all factors that constrain or influence what movement can be executed, and how it can be executed. Constraint-based information from the environment continually merges with the internal sensory information and task-based constraints. Perceptual systems intercept the nature of these constraints and determine ways to take them into account for movement planning and execution. This process is known as searching for affordance and ties together what is perceived by an individual and what action subsequently takes place. Affordances, according to Gibson in 1977, are qualities or clues in the environment that inevitably lead to specific action responses that require minimal sensory processing. In most movement scenarios, we have 3 factors: an individual or a person involved, the task, and the environment. And these systems are working together and interacting, and each of these systems contains multiple subsystems that also interact. The dynamic interplay among these systems is identified as dynamic systems, a term specifically describing systems that are dependent upon one another and change in relationship to one another. What these systems are and why they're important is best understood by examining how they influence movement. Systems are assemblies or groups of components that together have certain features or characteristics that are task-specific. Synergies are part of human systems, as are cardiopulmonary, endocrine, neuromuscular, and psychological systems. The features and characteristics of systems impose constraints to movement. A constraint is a barrier or restriction, as we heard in the previous slide, that must be used to avoided or overcome for effective movement to take place. Constraints may dictate precisely how a movement must be done or what movement must be done. In some cases, constraints may be exploited to offer an advantage or enabling situation or an enabling situation depending on the task. Constraints practically are physical barriers. They're sometimes rules or instructions or any number of other factors that are manipulated as part of the practice microstructure. They may be as simple as adding stress, or maybe some time pressure, or setting up situations in which player is forced to move in only one direction. Constraints are not presented haphazardly, but are specifically introduced into practice to give the learner an opportunity to creatively overcome game-like challenges. Consider the case of the child learning to climb on a high climbing structure as shown in your textbook on figure 9.2 on page 194. The feature of falling is a common constraint to climbing. So learning to climb and land safely from heights is a first step. In this figure, the girl is first learning to land from higher and higher heights, which gives her the confidence to climb higher on the climbing structure and thus enhance her climbing abilities. The dynamical systems theory evolved because over the years scientists identified a weakness in the cognitive-based theories. In the slide you can see an example of a cognitive-based theory, such as the schema theory. The weakness was seen as the perceived inability for the central nervous system to control movement in isolation from all other significant control agents. According to the work of Edwards in motor learning, cognitive-based theories are closed and top-down theories, meaning that the brain, in this case, commands all lower regions of action production without the need for outside help, which, according to the dynamical systems theory, is completely unrealistic. The homunculus is commonly used today in scientific disciplines such as motor learning and psychology as a teaching or memory tool to describe the distorted scale model of a human, drawn or sculpted to reflect the relative space human body parts occupy in the somatosensory cortex and the motor cortex, commonly referred to then as, and seen here in this diagram as, the sensory homunculus or the motor homunculus. You can also see the sculptured visual representation of the human in the bottom left corner. Both the motor and sensory homunculi usually appear as small men superimposed over the top of a precentral or postcentral part of the brain for motor and sensory cortices respectively. And again, you can see on the diagram the somatosensory and motor homunculus represented. The homunculus is oriented with feet medial and shoulders lateral on top of both the precentral and the postcentral gyrus for both the motor and the sensory. The man's head is depicted upside down in relation to the rest of the body, such that the forehead is closest to the shoulders. The lips, hands, feet, and sex organs have more sensory neurons than other parts of the body, so the homunculus has correspondingly large lips, hands, feet, and genitals. The motor homunculus is very similar to the sensory homunculus, but differs also in several ways. Specifically, the motor homunculus has a portion for the tongue, most lateral, while the sensory homunculus has an area for the genitalia, most medial, and an area for visceral organs, most lateral. Well known in the field of neurology, this is commonly known as the little man inside the brain. In other words, this idea that the homunculus, in an analogy of the homunculus, that the little man in your brain is responsible for choosing sort of a, if they're a composer, like a musical score of muscle activations. It plays the score on a desired muscular contraction and actions. In the analogy, the little man is in charge of the entire process and it's involved in selecting and playing the most correct notes, contractions, and actions. Of course, the criticism of cognitive-based theories is that the brain alone is incapable of controlling all the actions, or all the aspects of every action. Nikolai Bernstein in the mid-1900s was the first movement scientist to offer a convincing alternative to the problem of the little man in the brain. The control of movement could not be reduced to central mechanisms of control, but he believed that it must take into account forces acting on the body, such as inertia, reactive forces, gravitational and centripetal forces. So then how could the large number of ways in which various body and environmental variables interact and be organized meaningfully to produce a coordinated action? And thus we have the evolution and beginning of the dynamic systems theory approach. Some of the problems identified by Bernstein include context, which means the conditioned variability problem, also the degrees of freedom problem, but both constitute and acknowledge the high degree of variability and factors that go into coordinated movements. And so these issues continue to be of concern to the dynamical systems theory approach as well. So back to our practice paradigms now, and thinking about the systems theory relative to the constraints-led approaches. So we know that learning involves overcoming constraints, detecting and understanding the affordances, and coupling perception with actions. In a constraints-led setting, it's important to have available all the perception information that is available and present during a game setting. For instance, coordination during a cricket batting practice is developed differently off of a pitching machine and maybe from video virtual reality images than from a real bowler because the information is offered differently. These differences in information change perception, which thus changes the perception-action coupling. Now, there's an interesting follow-up to the cricket batting example on page 195 in the concepts and action box of your textbook. Back to our example of learning to climb, remember that constraints are presented to give the learner an opportunity to overcome challenges. In this photo, this is the example of where the girl is first learning to jump and land safely from a variety of different heights before becoming more proficient in her ability to climb to higher heights. This model provided by Edwards complements what we've been discussing in the context of a different author. You can see here the varying factors and constraints that are represented on either side of the triangle that result in the performance. And this is the triangulation of the effects of constraints on learning. Remember that constraints are simply boundaries that limit the possible values or patterns that a system can assume and that are imposed by the organism, physical environment, and the task itself, which is essentially the same as what we're seeing in our textbook with Ives. This, again, is simply a different representation of the same concept. From an instructional standpoint, coaches and teachers, recreation leaders should be wary of overly breaking down movements into small constituent components of practicing those components separately, as critical perceptual information may be lost in translation. Instead, physical activity leaders should consider basic simplification strategies in which the movements are kept relatively whole. Think about your experience in teaching games for understanding and the concepts of TGFU that are built precisely on that motor learning principle. Further, to implement effective constraint-led instruction, coaches must have knowledge of how the environment, the task, and the individual interact. That's the value of having an experienced coach that understands these intricacies. This is particularly important when working during childhood and development, as physical constraints such as muscle strength and hand size not only influence movement control, but they also may change rapidly over time. So as you start working with children that are further along in their development, you've got to consider the strategies and tactics and coaching approach that you use. As I referred to earlier, back to the concepts in action from page 195, we can see that in this particular visual, the batting swing differs between the live pitching and off a pitching machine because each provides its own certain distinct constraints. When used properly, the constraints-led approach requires the learner to figure out on their own the best movement solutions. The process, known as discovery or exploratory learning, is fundamentally rooted in an individual trial and error approach to learning. It requires the learner to search for optimal strategies to do a task, given the constraints of the task. This process includes finding the best perceptual cues or variables to produce motor responses that are specific to the environment and task constraints and fit within the individual's own physiological and psychological makeup. In discovery learning, explicit skills are not taught, but rather the learner is taught or led how to learn the skill by himself or herself in a model called guided discovery. The instructor's role is critical in this process. Instead of providing prescriptive instructions or precise modeling, the instructor leads the learner through a progression of problems using limited feedback in the traditional sense, and thus emphasizes the implicit learning approach of a learning process over an explicit process, an implicit learning process over an explicit process. Deliberate practice is a specific term describing practice activities with specific features, namely high levels of motivation and effort, activities based on knowledge and characteristics of the performer, immediate and continual feedback, a large amount of repetition, and an intent to improve. It's commonly regarded that 10,000 hours of deliberate practice will help facilitate expert performance in an outcome. But some authors, such as Baker, have concluded that that number of hours is variable depending on a variety of factors, the activity itself, the team versus individual sport context. But regardless of the exact number of hours of practice and the nature of early exposure, there is an overwhelming consensus that expert athletes spend more time in on-field practice, more time in challenging activities, and more time in off-field practice related activities such as video reviewing and weight training. Erickson noted that improvement over time was not a linear process and is prone to stall once a comfortable level of automaticity was reached. He noted this arrested development would continue even with accumulations of practice because the practice is not effortful toward improvement and change. The concepts of discovery learning, systems theory with constraints-led approach, and deliberate practice give rise to the fundamental features of practice and the instructional strategies in order to effectively implement them. It should be noted, though, that researchers have also identified barriers that prevent individuals from engaging in deliberate practice and achieving a high level of expertise. These barriers were time, resource availability, motivation, and effort. In addition to the barriers presented earlier, the discovery learning dynamic systems with constraints-led approaches and deliberate practice models and concepts also give rise to the 5 essential features of practice and the instructional strategies to implement them. These features are the specific intention to improve and master the skill, a strong motivation and effort, an individual-based practice and learner input into practice, effective communication and information, and overlearning with variation. Each of these is discussed in our subsequent slides, and I hope that you have a better understanding of each of them in the context of your professional choice of teacher, coach, recreation leader, or other. In its most basic form, each practice microstructure and the practice macrostructure must include specific and general goals. These goals may be to overcome weaknesses, maximize strengths, or change techniques. The goal of practice is not simply the overarching goal to get better, but each practice session must aim toward some improvement in some factor. Learners generally adopt 2 types of achievement goals, mastery or performance. The intention in mastery goals is to improve and learn, and comparisons are made to oneself regarding achievement. In other words, we refer to this sometimes as relative improvement. In contrast, the intention of performance skills is to be better than others or norm reference standards. Learners across the age, disability, and skill continuum variously may adopt either or both types of achievement goals with success, but in the long run, an overarching focus toward mastery increases learning outcomes, provides far more flexible and adaptive behaviors, and improves the motivational climate. One of the hallmarks of successful coaching and teaching is thoughtful planning and organized practice sessions with precise goals and objectives that may be based on individual skills or team strategies. Best coaches of the highest level athletes made use of limited practice time by maximizing player involvement. In other words, when you're in a practice scenario, avoid the standing around. They also simulated game stress and physical and mental efforts as often as possible. Expert coaches, like expert athletes, and have more domain-specific knowledge and use that to provide more advanced instructional feedback to guide learners through the problem areas. And this is what our hope is for all of our health and physical education graduates at Mount Royal University. We want to build your instructional knowledge and content knowledge to maximize your effectiveness. Interviews with elite coaches support this data, revealing that further practice quality designed with skill learning, intensity, high expectations, and competitive specificity was paramount. Put differently, the consensus is that it is more effective to have a short, intense, purposeful, and highly organized practice than a long, carefree, and poorly organized practice. The focus of practice and of instructional strategies should also differently across the continuum of learning processes, particularly as it relates to children and novices. For instance, technical instruction is important for novices and children at a young age, and an emphasis on enjoyment and social interaction is paramount for children. In later stages, that's when you can introduce team tactics and responding to game-like chaos and pressure situations that may become more important at the elite levels. Without maximal effort, maximal improvement cannot be achieved. High physiological effort is necessary for maximal physiological adaptations, such as improving anaerobic threshold and maximal motor unit activation. From our OLM from Chapter 4, we know that this level of physiological effort cannot happen without concentrated mental effort, particularly focused attention. Effort must be maximal day in and day out and year in and year out, with the caveat that rest is vital for both physiological and psychological recovery and adaptation. Effort during play is largely placed on what brings enjoyment, though, especially for kids. According to the work of Erickson and Lehman, motivation to continue putting time and effort into practice that may be unenjoyable and without immediate benefits may be the biggest obstacle to obtaining expert performance. Now, remember that expert performance is not always the goal and objective. In fact, it will be argued that our work here as physical education leaders is to try to encourage people to be active for life. So, what may be important in terms of intensity and the psychological considerations for an elite athlete may not be the same for the recreational athlete intending to participate for life. In fact, one of the when we talk about the risk of over practicing at a young age and getting into the specialization at a young age, it's the work of Wall and Cote in 2007 that identified the fact that dropout rates have been linked to early specialization and all year training in an on field and off field environment. In other words, dryland training in that particular specific sport on a year-round basis is just not in the best interests of kids. And that evidence is what provides us the ability and the confidence to be able to encourage people to diversify their activities, particularly at the pre-adolescent stages of their physical activity experiences. Deliberate practice should be based on the individual's prior knowledge in some cases, the team's prior knowledge and existing skills and abilities. These abilities may include the physiological or psychological characteristics and may involve learning style differences. One of the most important strategies cited by elite coaches is that they take a long-term approach in developing individual athletes. Remember, this chapter is about practice and instruction, and most importantly, coaches must learn to understand the learning situation and match the performer's characteristics with their intended outcomes of their practice. Practice is most effective when the learner has some control over the practice environment. Think about back to your days as an athlete. Did you ever have an opportunity to have some input or some say into when and where and what you were practicing? When athletes and participants are allowed to select their own schedules and specific aspects of what they choose to practice, performance and learning are more solidly retained. Enabling the learner some control over when they receive feedback and instruction is another strategy for empowering the learner. When learners are provided some control over when and how feedback is provided, performance and learning are better compared to a strict instructor-based schedule, are better than compared to a strict instructor-based schedule. Giving the learner some control over the practice environment and feedback appears to enhance meaningfulness and motivation, and enables the user to extract the most relevant information and thus facilitates more complete information processing. In other words, maximizes learning. Part of my role is to connect the theory to practice, and so beyond the textbook, there's lots of work that's been done in this area. And I wanted to just bring to your attention a master's research thesis done by Steve Chapman in 2015. This particular study shows that a constraints-led approach is often beneficial to players who are at the very early stage in developing the skill of spinning a ball hard. This, again, we're still talking about the context of cricket in this case, as we have in this OLM already. This coaching approach allows the learners to practice the new movement pattern in its entirety and become familiar with the way in which the involved body components interact during the movement. The learner is able to investigate the best possible way they can exploit the constraints to produce success, and is able to attempt different movement options without the fear of negative feedback from an external source due to the incorrect execution of the skill. Developing skills through a constraints-led approach forces the performer to actively learn and create their own movement solutions rather than rely on external sources to provide them with the answer. And therefore, the performer establishes an intimate knowledge of the skill and the possible ways it can be adapted to respond to the dynamically changing performance environment whilst maintaining success. In practice, traditional methods have focused on the perfection of movements in comparison to an ideal model, and then deconstructing movements into smaller components, as we discussed earlier, and as supported by the work of Renshaw. Once each component has been refined to match the desired model, in that concept, they're reassembled to create the desired successful movement. Coaches are active during that entire learning process, providing verbal feedback as to how the movement compares to the ideal model, and as learners commonly fit within FIT's cognitive stages of learning, which requires that the learner to be consciously aware of the process. In this thesis, however, it shows that this method of coaching is less effective than a constraints-led approach when developing spin rate in an inexperienced spin bowler. Of those participants who practiced under the constraints-led approach, several had decreased performance following the intervention. However, rather than defining these decreases as a loss of ability, the ecological dynamics approach suggests that these participants were still exploring and had not yet found an appropriate successful movement pattern at the time of the post-testing. The literature is fairly clear about the relationship between an athlete and a coach and the importance of strong communication to facilitate learning and performance. Effective communication fosters trust, encourages and motivates, and transmits knowledge and information. Communication is a two-way street in which the learner and the instructor must reveal their needs, their thoughts, their struggles, victories, their plans, and their intentions. Communication is thus necessary to foster intention and effort and create the environment for all learner-based practice and control. In the next few slides, we'll take a closer look at the way communication is typically provided in the form of instructions and post-movement feedback. So as teachers, providing instructions is typically done verbally, although sometimes we see a written component provided to athletes, but very rarely. When we're teaching, we often use demonstrations as an important way to articulate what our pre-practice instructions are. And I can't overemphasize, the importance of providing a demonstration, particularly when we're working at a more complex or dynamic instruction. So my general rule of thumb for working with children is to always use a demonstration. Always reinforce in a visual way what you're saying with your auditory instructions. Some children learn better as listening in a listening capacity, and some learn better by watching. And in most cases, kids also learn better by actually feeling and experiencing it themselves. Instructions are often centered on identifying the goal of the movement, but even this apparently simple instruction can prove confusing in regard to the type of task, particularly as it relates to open and closed skills. In the work of Hodges and Franks, they noted that a specific set of instructions regarding movement dynamics could work well in a closed skill activity, but the same set of instructions for an open skill would be inconsistent with the variability required of the performer and could result in confusion of the athlete. This suggestion could be expanded to more general terms in that there appears to be no single optimal movement template for a given movement, only what is optimal for that given person. In other words, every child, every athlete is an individual, and what may work for some athletes may not work for others. Explicit instructions on what to do and how to do it, therefore, are less effective, and providing explicit knowledge of the processes and the perceptual information that tend to be learned implicitly, that may be a detriment to performance and learning. In their extensive review, Hodges and Franks noted that there are too many learner and practice variables mediating the effects of instruction to make definitive and specific conclusions. As we said earlier, individual learner personality characteristics, habits, and prior experiences all influence instruction and interpretation by this participant. The table on page 203, the guidelines for providing instruction, really help provide an explanation to these 5 expectations. Have a read of that and have a thorough understanding if you are in a situation where you're encountering an opportunity to be a coach, a teacher, or a leader in some capacity of children and youth. Providing timely feedback to the learner regarding performance is one of the characteristics of deliberate practice. Feedback is also essential in the discovery learning process, as well as to the goal of making the learning process tailored to the individual. Yet the nature of effective feedback is not always clear. Information passed from an instructor to an athlete regarding aspects of performance is properly defined as augmented feedback, or the acronym AFB, because the information is value added. That is, the feedback has enhanced, modified, or revealed information that the performer would not normally receive. Now, most augmented feedback is typically received from a coach or a physical educator, although technology these days enables electronic devices such as iPads using digital video and other software to provide AFB. There is another form of augmented feedback. It's called augmented sensory feedback. It's typically referred to as biofeedback. And this is when we use electronic devices to amplify biological processes to make them more noticeable to the learner. In the example we see on your screen, you'll notice that the heart rate monitor enables the swimmer to know what their heart rate is during their swimming workout. Augmented feedback is used for not only information but also as a motivator as well. That feedback can come in 2 different forms, in verbal or in nonverbal, and we've discussed both of those, and you can see by the content of this slide some examples of that. But also, AFB is also used for reinforcement. In other words, making a substantial difference in the habits or behaviors by reinforcing the expected behaviors. And of course, it's also used as guidance to help inform the athletes or the learner towards the correct actions. This model by Edwards also provides us with a different perspective of the classifications of feedback. In this particular case, all feedback from all sources is indicated at the top of the graph here, and we divide it up into 2, in extrinsic and intrinsic types of feedback. Let's focus a little bit on the intrinsic sensory feedback at first, and we see that we can get feedback from ourselves, from our exteroreceptive receptors, and from our proprioceptors. Our exteroreceptors take in content from the external environment, and that includes our ability to touch and our ability to hear and our ability to see what's happening. And as I mentioned before, and as I've suggested in his textbook, the extrinsic augmented feedback system includes a verbal and a nonverbal, and in that particular case, either one can have a relationship to the knowledge of the results, which we'll talk about next, and the knowledge of performance. Feedback content can be based on the response outcome or the response production, respectively known as knowledge of results, KRs, or knowledge of performance, KPs. KR is information about the outcome of the motor skill, such as running time, the jumping height, or the location of the tennis serve. KR is the most common form of AFB and is generally considered the simplest to gather and provide. KP is often more complex than KR and provides information on how the movement was made, such as a verbal indication of arm position during swimming, video assessment of the leg position during hurdling, or a graphical biomechanical assessment of gait kinematics. The complexity of AFB concerns include the amount of error that prompts a correction. In the qualitative, for example, the qualitative provides information about the direction of an error. Too much, too little, too fast, too slow, without reference to the magnitude of the error. Quantitative provides information about the direction and the magnitude of the error. It's a bit more precise than qualitative. Quantitative tells the learner how to change. The instructional nature of AFB, or augmented feedback, directs the learner to how the feedback is used to alter performance. Feedback processing is manipulated by either providing descriptive AFB or prescriptive AFB. Descriptive augmented feedback is just that, a KR or KP description of what was done in the movement. Remember, KR, knowledge of results, and KP is knowledge of performance. In most situations, knowledge of performance is preferred over knowledge of results because it provides greater precision in conveying information. This type of AFB may prompt the learner into self-discovery over what they did wrong or what they need to do to correct their mistakes. In some cases, though, description provides no useful information for the athlete because they have no background to interpret its meaning. Prescriptive augmented feedback does not provide information on past movements, but rather provides information on what needs to be done next time to correct the movement. Prescription takes away some of the problem-solving needs of the learner, but can help the learner progress along a correct path. There's a growing recognition that good coaches need to move away from the time-honored prescriptive nature, in other words, telling an athlete what to do, and more into a learner-based, exploratory, and self-discovery model. Let's take a comparison that you can look yourself on page 208 in figure 9.5 of precise prescriptive augmented feedback versus constraints-based augmented feedback. First, let's look at example on the left. The instructor here is providing physical guidance, augmented feedback, and precise prescriptive instructions on the orientation of the shoulder and elbow during a right cross punch. In the subsequent trial, the learner will likely be placing attention on his arm. In the second example on the right-hand side, the instructor is behind the bag instructing the learner to drive the punch through the bag to hit her hand, thus providing a movement goal with an external focus of attention. Constraints are the bag itself and the target location. The movement goal will require the learner to do a full extension and shoulder torso rotation to accomplish the task of driving the punch through the heavy bag, even without consciously thinking about the movement mechanics. There's lots of different ways that we receive augmented feedback, and typically they're categorized as verbal and modeling, video, graphic. In this particular case, we see the rowers receiving a graphical feedback based on their own performance and then their team as a whole. When we're referring to the frequency of augmented feedback, we're typically talking about how often the feedback is given over the course of a practice session. That can range from after every time you do a motor skill trial to once at the end of every practice session. It depends on the coaching style and the context of the activity. There is no precise answer to how much is sufficient. There's no right amount, but there is consensus that too much feedback could lead to information overload or direct the learner to rely solely on the AFB as a crutch in place of self-knowledge. Remember, while there's no right amount for a group, there is an optimal level of feedback that is completely dependent on the individual learner and how they manage. And so that's the challenge of working in a team environment, is to understand your athletes individually and be able to provide the appropriate amount of feedback based on their particular needs. Now, as a bit of a summary here, regarding the feedback, we know that the augmented feedback should motivate and aid in the performance, but not stifle independent thought or individual strategies. Remember, we want to facilitate an exploratory or discovery environment. Work toward lessening the feedback or changing the nature of the feedback as the learning progresses. In other words, it's not always the same kind of feedback as the athlete and the student in a teaching environment continues to grow and mature. We need to adjust our style, and obviously the feedback is part of that style. If possible, try to allow the learner to have some control over when and what kind of feedback is provided. And eventually, we should be trying to use the feedback to channel the learner to explore either a narrower or broader range of movement options, depending on what the outcomes are. Overlearning is continued practice even past a point where performance seems to have peaked or plateaued. The benefits of overlearning include modifying brain structures to be more resistant to forgetting and to enhance movement adaptability and flexibility. These benefits are not simply gained by doing more, but also by doing different in order to maximize learning. There is, though, a point of diminishing returns. In other words, instructors need to balance out the cost of, say, practice time to the benefit or improvement ratio. It's important to understand that the amount of practice or the amount of time you spend practicing is always secondary to the quality of practice. Manipulating the schedule of practice enables the instructor to manipulate the number and variation in repetitions in regard to the practice macrostructure. Massed practice is a practice structure in which practice is compacted into intervals with long durations and limited breaks between practice sessions. Conversely, distributed practice is when practices are spread out over long time intervals because of more rest periods and/or shorter practice sessions. As a general finding, distributed practices are thought to be more effective, but both massed and distributed should be used to vary the practice schedule. Now, Edwards goes on to talk about specifically that distributed practices promote better acquisition performance than massed practices. He believes that the buildup of both physiological and psychological fatigue resulting from massed practice imposes greater demands upon the learner and can play a powerful role in depressing the ability to respond skillfully during practice. However, according to some of the evidence, especially around discrete motor skills, there is a suggestion that the disadvantage of mass practices um, is not as prevalent as it may seem. In fact, it may even point towards the benefits of long-term retention in the particular component of discrete skills. However, scheduling for continuous learning seems clear. Distribute practice to provide frequent rest while seeing that the total time in rest exceeds the actual practice time. Logistics, of course, always plays a role. So when creating a practice schedule, coaches and instructors must weigh the relative benefits of practice time against the needs of the learner, as well as those factors that help learners gain from more massed practices. Individuals in good physical condition who are highly motivated and who have acquired a good grasp of the skill being practiced are most likely to benefit from additional massing of practices. And that's according to the work of Christina Korkos in 1988. In this diagram, we see Bernstein's cyclogram measurement method, and it helped reveal that the process of hammering could vary greatly even in an expert blacksmith, such as you see in this diagram. Cyclograms, which are basically the dotted lines that you see moving, tracking the progress of the hammerhead, revealed that even as a blacksmith repeatedly is hitting a small target with astonishing accuracy, the trajectory of the hammerhead varied greatly throughout the motion, particularly at the movement's midpoint. Bernstein is often quoted as saying that this is an intentional strategy by the user and is referring to it as repetition without repeating. As we continue to take our deep dive into how participants learn, especially in the context of practice and instruction, we note that blocked practice is practicing a single motor skill completely and then moving on to the next motor skill, and so forth. Random or variable practice has skills being practiced at variable times and occurrences over the course of a practice session. Generally, variable practice has been shown to improve retention, probably because the learner is more actively engaged and attentive, leading to their own self-discovery of movement patterns. Another advantage of variable practice is the promotion of contextual interference. Contextual interference occurs when a skill is practiced in the context of another task, or when randomly changing from practicing one thing to another. This would include rapidly changing from one offensive drill to another, or forcing a switch from an offensive drill to a defensive drill. Regardless of the practice scheduling, it's important to understand that eventually movement patterns need to be stabilized and then destabilized via variations and diversifications. Consider a basketball team practicing half-court offensive plays. At first, the drills are run without defenders to enable the players to get the overall idea of the movement pattern and purposes. Eventually, variation in the form of constraints is added. Initially, this could be different movement outcomes like different people shooting or different people scoring, or the addition of defenders. Over time, defensive set variations, differently skilled defenders quickening the pattern of play and running the drill from a full court would enable a diversification. Further diversification would include varying the offensive movement patterns and adding flexible movement patterns based on defensive sets. Other variable practices can be illustrated by a golfer at the driving range switching clubs every few balls, a baseball player seeing different pitches every couple of pitches, or a football team's offense practicing offensive plays randomly as opposed to running the same play over and over again. Again, let's link some evidence to this concept. Shea and Morgan had subjects practice 3 different tasks, A, B, and C tasks, that involved responding to a stimulus light with the correct series of rapid movements of the hand and arm, with each task having a different predetermined sequence. One group of subjects practiced the tasks in a blocked order, completing all task A practice before moving to task B practice, which they completed before moving to task C practice. A second group practiced in random order. No more than 2 consecutive trials could occur for any one task. The 2 groups had the same amount of practice tasks on A, B, and C, and had the same amount of total practice. They differed only in the order in which the tasks were presented. The results are presented in this figure. The goal was to respond to the stimulus and complete the movements as quickly as possible. So in this graph, the lower times are indicated represent a more skilled performance. Notice that during acquisition, the blocked condition was far more effective for performance with shorter times than random condition. But recall that differences during acquisition could not be interpreted as differences in learning. Rather, delayed retention or transfer tests are needed to evaluate learning. We talked about that in, I think it was chapter 7. Shea and Morgan tested for learning by conducting retention tests after 10 minutes and again after 10 days. These tests were conducted under either randomized or blocked conditions, which produced 4 subgroups. The following abbreviations that you see on the graph indicate the condition in acquisition and the condition in retention, respectively RB, random blocked, RR, random random, BR, blocked random, and BB, blocked blocked. The first character in the pair indicates the condition during acquisition, random is R, as I said, or blocked is B, and the second member of the pair indicates the performance conditions in retention. When the retention tests were under random conditions, the group that had random practice in acquisition, RR, which is represented on the graph as a solid blue, greatly outperformed the group with the blocked conditions in acquisition, which is the red line, in other words, the BR. When the retention tests were under blocked conditions, again, the random conditions in acquisition, RB, outperformed those who had blocked conditions in acquisition, BB. But these differences were much smaller than for the random retention tests. Clearly, the random conditions in acquisition were always more effective for retention, but this benefit was clearly dependent on the nature of the retention test. This work, by the way, is a result of Schmidt and Lee's textbook example of Shea and Morgan's experiment. As I mentioned a couple slides ago, contextual interference is the degree of interference created by the ordering of skills within a practice session. Blocked practice results in low contextual interference, whereas random practice results in higher amounts of contextual interference. And we saw a little bit of that in the Shea and Morgan experiment previously. This figure represents a schedule of tennis drills based on difficulty and practice variability and contextual interference. Low variability includes the coach hitting the ball after ball from a hopper, in other words, basket feeding to the player, to force one type of stroke. High variability involves gameplay. Low contextual interference is simply rote repetition. High contextual interference involves more variability in strokes. Note that all drills are designed toward a single goal of increasing shoulder rotation and stroke velocity. Having practices with a variety of ways in which the same skill is introduced has a beneficial effect on learning, and this is largely because of the schema theory. The schema theory is based on the notion that the memories underlying skills are constructed for entire classes of a skill, rather than for each specific way in which a skill might be performed. That is, individual memories of skills across a variety of different ways and contexts in which they are practiced are not stored in memory. Rather, a single memory for all the various ways a particular class of skill might be performed comprise what's called a generalized memory of the skill, and that then is retrieved and utilized for very specific ways in which the skill is performed. Based on the schema theory, varied practice has been argued as being superior not only for open skills but also for closed skills where conditions are consistent.
Imagine that you would like to teach a child to toss a bean bag at a target that is 3 feet away. Most people would show the child how to toss the bean bag, set the child on a line 3 feet from the target, and have him practice, practice, practice. Makes sense, doesn't it? However, studies have shown there is a better way for children to learn, retain, and generalize this skill. In fact, research has shown that having the child practice the beanbag toss at different distances, for example at 2 and 4 feet, improves performance. Practice from 2 and 4 feet provides the child with relevant contrasts to the desired skill of hitting a target that is 3 feet away, and leads to better learning, retention, and transfer to other skills. Highlighting the relevant contrasts of tossing a beanbag from different but similar distances reinforces the learning, retention, and generalization of accurately hitting a given target. Similarly, highlighting the relevant contrasts in learning how the rules of phonics operate in syllables and words reinforces the learning, retention, and generalization of word recognition skills. The varied practice model leads the learner to improved skill development, as well as an understanding of the system underlying the skill.
Now, mental practice is often thought as a component of exercise psychology or sports psychology. We also, of course, see the connection to learning in the context of mental practice. And most conferences that I attend around motor learning are also coupled with a sports psychology conference because the contents are so closely linked. Among the practice techniques found in high-level performance is the regular use of mental practicing. Now, there's a wide variety of mental practice that includes things like imagery and visualization, observational learning, relaxation, stress control, positive talk strategies, etc., etc. We're only going to focus primarily in this textbook and in this particular end of the OLM on observation and imagery techniques, as they're common and they play a role in other mental practice techniques as well. The most common method of instruction, particularly for new learners, is modeling, otherwise known as demonstrations or observational learning. In modeling, the instructor or model demonstrates the skill in person or in video, and then that learner mimics the skill. Modeling generally improves the effectiveness of practice alone, but the effects of modeling are related to who models, the type of skill being modeled, what is measured as the outcome of the learning process, as well as the intentions and observational tactics of the learner. Because observation itself, not mimicry, is the critical component of the learning process, observational learning is considered mental practice. Not all motor skills or movement characteristics can equally be learned from modeling. Observers learn more from serial and continuous movement modeling compared to discrete movements. Exactly what's learned during the observation may depend on the learner age, perhaps their experience or maturation level. Observation Observational learning appears to follow the same principles as an external focus of attention, in that it appears beneficial for the learner to focus attention on the movement goal or outcome rather than specific movement features, which fosters self-exploration and movement solutions. However, it's important at times for modelers to direct the intention of the learner toward the learning movement form versus the movement outcomes. Observation has a direct neurological consequence. A particular group of visual motor neurons, called the mirror neurons, work in a system called the motor resonance system. On the next slide, we'll see an illustration of what we mean by that motor resonance system when it's activated when movements are observed, whether live, photo, or video, and when they're executed. The motor resonance system acts differently depending on the motor actions being observed. The system is less active when observing non-human actors, or when the movement is impossible, or when the observer is entirely unfamiliar with the task. When the motor resonance system is active, it appears to have four main functions: to understand the action, to understand the intention, to enable imitation, and to understand behavioral state. In other words, parts of the motor system are active when watching motor behaviors in order to help the brain comprehend exactly what it's seeing, understanding why, the intention, the movement is being carried out, to help the brain later imitate or mimic the movement, and lastly, to help understand the emotions of the one being observed. This graphic is a comparison of motor imagery and observation to actual movement. Each functional MRI represents a pooled set of data from 15 subjects who are reaching for an object, with the lighter areas representing areas of brain activation. On the top are fMRI images during the actual reaching movement. In the middle traces, the subjects are watching the reaching movement being performed, and in the bottom traces, the subjects are only imagining the movement. The active areas that overlap across the three conditions are suggested to be areas where mirror neurons are housed. Okay, here's some more research. This was done by a variety of authors, Kyan, Soon, Lee, et cetera, et cetera. The title of the article in question here was an approach to ballet dance training through Microsoft Kinect and visualization in a cave virtual reality environment, et cetera, et cetera. Again, in this particular case, the visualization subsystem was used to compare the detected gesture units against a library of teacher-based gestures and presents immersive visual feedback to the student, thereby quantifying his or her performance. The feedback offers two visual modes for comparing the student's performance of movements with the teacher's, and an overall score component to quantify the training session. The virtual environment, again, this is an experiment where virtual reality goggles are being used to perform the movement, and it's a really cool mix of technology and motor learning. But the virtual environment that's afforded by the cave infrastructure enables the student to experience his or her own performance and evaluate it in the same spatial context as in which it was performed. This provides unique insight and suggestion for how to adjust and improve enacted dance movements during an interactive training session. Okay, I'm going to point out some of the really neat uses of technology in this experiment. The CAVE automatic virtual environment is better known by the recursive acronym CAVE, or CAVE, and again, standing for all that big long title. It's an immersive virtual reality environment where projectors are used and are directed to 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 of the walls of a room-sized cube. The name is also a reference to the allegory of the cave in Plato's Republic, where a philosopher contemplates perception, reality, and illusion. For those of you that are interested in a bit of a deeper dive, you can see the cube in the middle of the figure on this particular page. So to carry on with this example, the Kinect is a motion sensing input device used by Microsoft for the Xbox 360 video game console and Windows PC. It's based around a webcam style add-on peripheral for the Xbox 360 console, and it enables users to control and interact with the Xbox 360 without the need to touch a game controller. This is a real natural interface using gestures and spoken commands. The project is aimed at broadening the Xbox 360's audience beyond its typical game user base. And finally, just to define the use of the virtual reality, which is basically computer simulated environments that represent a physical presence in places in the real world, as well as in imaginary worlds. The most current virtual reality environments are primarily visual experiences, displayed either on a computer screen or through those special stereoscopic displays and the goggles. But some simulations include additional sensory information such as sound through speakers or headphones, and it becomes very immersive when you get into the really high levels of virtual reality. Imagery is most often thought of as the mental or cognitive rehearsal of a skill, generally in the form of visualization. In other words, seeing the skill in your own mind or imagining multiple sensory aspects of the skill, not just the visual. Imagery is used for two general purposes. First of all, skill acquisition and performance preparation. Skill acquisition typically involves the learner modeling the motor skill in their own mind over and over again. Learners may emphasize certain problem areas or emphasize the look or the feel of the movement depending on what's meaningful to them. Imagery without physical practice is only marginally successful, whereas physical practice with imagery is generally better than physical practice alone. There are three general characteristics that are part of the imagery process. They are the perspective, in other words, the internal versus external, the viewing angle, and the dominant sensory modality, as example by kinesthetic versus visual. In the internal perspective, the person views himself in the first person, as he would in real life. In the external or third person perspective, the person views himself from out of body. The viewing angle is what is actually included in the mind's picture, for example, from the top or from the back in a third person view, or the view of what the first person image is looking at. Viewing angle appears to be largely dependent on the motor skill being imagined or imaged. The third factor in imagery is the dominant sensory modality. Imagers tend to emphasize either visual or kinesthetic information, even if sound and other information is included. Regardless of which combination of perspective, angle, or sensory modality is imaged, there is a growing belief that agency is critical as to how the brain is activated. Agency in this case refers to the identity of the actual imaged person. Imagers may see themselves or others performing. Even if the imager takes on a first-person perspective, but takes on the identity of someone else, then the imager may not be in full control of her actions. Like observational learning, mental imaging of motor actions has direct neurological implications. The same areas of the brain are active in similar manners during imaging a task as when actually performing the task. Magnetic resonance imaging and other brain scanning methods have shown that real and imagined movements share a common physiological substrate, but changing agency, perspective, viewing angle, and sensory modality changes the area in the brain that are active. Some research findings suggest that receiving the desired that imply that to receive the desired physiological or motor response, that the nature of mental activity should be specific towards that response. However, and a number of studies support that view, um, albeit this is a bit of a controversial area in motor learning. That there are studies that are showing up that include weeks of mental imaging uh, of weight training improves muscular strength. So studies show effective mental strength training have used a first-person perspective with external focus imagery in which the movement outcome, like moving an attached force transducer or lifting a table, is the intention. Such improvements have been ascribed to better central commands that are able to provide more activation and more efficient inter and intra-related muscle coordination. The key findings from these imagery studies is that the essential ingredient to the mental training is intention. In these diagrams, we see more examples of motor imagery and experience. In the fMRI images, experienced high jumpers and novice subjects were imaging or imagining a high jump task. The experienced jumpers displayed vastly different areas of brain activation, primarily by activation of motor and sensory areas, versus the novices, whose activation was mostly in the visual areas. This data demonstrates that practice and experience have contributed to the experts doing the task in a vastly different manner. This is a schematic illustration comparing imagery and observation. I would encourage you to visit page 218 to take a little bit more of a detailed look at it if you're interested. It's a bit of a summary around the concepts of mental practice. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with what a cybathon is, but we have
Sì, nel team mi trovo molto bene perché siamo italiani, quindi scherziamo, ridiamo, però allo stesso tempo lavoriamo molto bene insieme. Mi sento un po' un pioniere perché sto provando una tecnologia che non è ancora conosciuta e può essere sviluppata per il futuro. Ho una cuffia sulla testa con degli elettrodi che sono legati a un amplificatore che sono connessi a un computer, riconosce le mie onde cerebrali che invio pensando a dei movimenti in base all'ostacolo che devo superare. Appunto elabora questi segnali e invia i comandi al gioco. Ho incontrato i ragazzi del team che mi hanno parlato di questo sistema, non ci credevo molto all'inizio, adesso sono molto entusiasta di portare avanti questo progetto.